Welcome to another session of our Theory Around the World series, where we at BDU invite inspiring practitioners from different parts of the world to explore how Theory U is being practiced in their unique contexts and fields of work. Today, we are honored to host Beth Mount, a pioneering voice in the movement for disability rights, community inclusion, and person-centered change. For more than 5 decades, Beth has worked alongside people with disabilities, families, communities, and organizations to challenge systems dehumanization and create pathways toward dignity, belonging, and meaningful participation in community life. Her work helped shape some of the earliest approaches to person-centered planning in the United States and internationally. Over the last 15 years, Beth has integrated Theory U and social presencing theater into her work with individuals, organizations, and communities. We invited her today to learn more about how Theory U became part of her journey and shaped the way she approaches change, inclusion, and community work. Beth, we are truly delighted to have you with us today and to learn from your remarkable journey and experience. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
So you've been working in the field of disability inclusion for more than 50 years by now. Can you take us back to the beginning? What first moved you toward this work, and what was happening in society at the time that that shaped your path?
So I have lived and worked in New York City and New York State for the last 38 years, but I am born and bred from Georgia, and I grew up in Atlanta. And I was shaped during the civil rights movement and during segregation and integration, desegregation. And that left a huge imprint on my imagination and my sense of what's possible in the world. When I was, let's just say it the way it was, in Georgia in 1965, which is when the schools desegregated, I was 10 years old. A third of the population of Georgia was Black, African American, a third of the 4 million people in Georgia. And yet, under segregation, I can honestly say we virtually, as the dominant white people, we virtually had no awareness and no contact with the Black community in Georgia. So to be a part of desegregation, to be a part of that time in history, and to be a part of the unfolding of such a significant social movement had a big impact on everything, and continues to, by the way. Only 8 years after schools were desegregated, I had my freshman year in college, I went to a state institution, Central State Hospital, and it was my first encounter with people living in institutions. And at that point in 1965, there were about 200,000 people in America living in 350 different institutions. Central State Hospital was one of the largest in the world. And what I experienced was so mortifying, so dehumanizing, so horrific, that there was something in me. It cracked my heart open, honestly, that what I saw was about 20 or 30 people with severe disabilities crammed into a day room without clothes on, without anything to do, with one staff person at the door with a pole that was used to poke people when they were hurting each other or when they were hurting themselves. It was probably 120 degrees because Georgia's hot. There was something inside of me that just felt the call to say, we are here. We are here to make a difference. I'm here to make a difference. We are here to make a difference. We can do better than this as a society and as people who care about each other.
So you were involved in such reality, and you felt very much motivated to change it. What would made you believe that it can be different, that you can make a change?
Well, first of all, living in this period of racial recalibration and transition in the South was, as I've already said, having such an impact. What we could do as a society to shift the pattern. So let me name this right up front, because I think what my entire journey of these 50 years has been is to shift the pattern from what Otto refers to as attentional violence and structural violence, right? And so to grow up in a culture where structural violence, segregation, had such a profound impact on the attentional violence, attentional potential was a visceral experience, right? And so, of course, I didn't have these words when I was 10 years old, right? But I was having the experience that something hugely important is happening, and we are coming to terms with how the structures of society have limited and hurt, if not crushed, people. And we are changing those conditions, we being a collective we. And now here I am 8 years later in college, having another experience of a situation that is profoundly disturbing from a structural violence point of view, and somehow knowing that we could do better from an attentional violence point of view. And so, yes, that was, that I was involved with, it's very important to say this all the way through. I was involved with already a wide network of activists and change makers. Okay, so it wasn't just like me showing up at Central State Hospital saying, I think I can make a difference, right? So little did I know I was in a special program that was influenced by Ivan Illich. We were being deschooled. I stayed in this alternative program throughout my college experience, where we had direct engagement in a social issue that we brought all of ourselves to respond to be immersed in, and then took all of our classes around that issue. And so there was this very wide network of activists, change makers, people from everyone from conscientious objectors. John O'Brien, who's one of my important mentors, was a conscientious objector. Many people in the deinstitutionalization movement were there for that reason. There were people working on the racial justice questions. And then there was a network, Judith Heumann, Judith Snow, Ed Roberts. There was a group of people with mostly physical disabilities who were also shaking society and saying, we can be different, we can do different. And so, yes, it was this very feeling a part of this very big movement of change makers and people who believed more was possible was an essential part of this call for me.
So I know we're kind of like rushing the story a bit, because at that time I understand that the whole idea of person-centered approaches started coming into being and getting both theorized and practiced, right? During around those times. And then a couple of decades later, you've met Theory U. So can you say a bit like what that added to what you already did in the field at that time?
Yes. Yes, I had the opportunity as a person engaged in things can be different to be a part of moving people out of institutions in Georgia and impacting educational environments for young people with disabilities who had only around 1972 were being allowed to go to public schools. So it wasn't until 1972 that people with disabilities had access to public schools. So I was already involved with a number of people whose lives were changing because they were having the possibility for more inclusion. But in many ways, people were still highly segregated, and we were not necessarily having a big impact on how we thought about what was possible for people. So I had the opportunity in my doctoral dissertation to develop this process called personal futures planning, which in retrospect is an attentional based methodology, right? Where the radical thing about person-centered planning in the 1970s is that it was a way to make a shift from seeing people from their deficiencies to seeing people with capacities, and from seeing people as non-human, really, that's really where things were, to not only that every life matters, that every human's life is worth supporting and realizing, but that there was a difference, that every person was here to make a difference, every single one of us, and that it was our job through person-centered planning to kind of unlock the keys to people's gifts and contributions, and then find ways, places, and possibilities for people to belong and be engaged and involved in their communities. And so at that point in time, that was a kind of a revelatory offering. And I had the opportunity to bring that into transition planning with young people coming out of high school and follow them along for years, right? So as a good doctoral dissertation will do, keeps you involved with people for years. And then I had the opportunity to go to the state of Connecticut. That was that's really when I started to move away, and work on an initiative with the most complicated people in the state. So this was an initiative, it was called the Positive Futures Project, and it was supported by the commissioner. So I just want to make that point, because in the early years of person-centered planning, most person-centered planning was unfolding in a place where there was organizational commitment to change, right? So, or here we are, our two aspects: individual personal change and organizational change. So this Connecticut experience was powerful because we were able to enter into the lives of people still in institutions who were considered the least likely to succeed in any way, shape, or form. And fortunately, with this capacity view and a strong commitment by many people to shift the way we think about what's possible for people, and also shift the environments that they were living in. So the attentional potential was being supported through person-centered planning, and then the structural devaluation, the structural violence was being addressed by investing in different opportunities, places for people to live, and opportunities for people to thrive, okay? And so these were very important breakthroughs, right? This was still all happening in the early 1980s. And it began this pretty significant shift. And then there were many people involved in this. Once again, many people in many circles, also trying different kinds of person-centered planning. And what was beginning to happen, I'm getting to where does theory U come in, is what was beginning to happen is everybody's all caught up in the sort of revelatory, illuminative, the illuminating element of person-centered planning, which has a very powerful impact on all of us when we do this well. But it was drifting away from organizational change, right? So we have more and more people investing in person-centered thinking and person-centered work, and bringing to life new possibilities for people. But then our organizations are drifting, and not only are they drifting away, but they are being kind of colonized by a whole different structure of care, what we still call institutional care, the medical model. This is really powerful in America because Medicaid began to be the primary funding source for people in the community. And in order to use the Medicaid money, the medical model comes back in. So how does Theory U come in? And it's actually been almost 20 years since I met Otto and Arowana, and it is very interesting to think about how significant that was for me, for us. So once again, I'm sitting here talking to you, but I represent a very large network of people who were learning together and thinking together and struggling together. And at that point, jumping out of buildings together. I mean, I say that because this split between what we knew was possible and what was really happening was agonizing. And so Theory U, first of all, it creates an incredibly vivid language and a model for change that mirrors what we've been doing, especially with person-centered planning. I mean, you can map person-centered planning when it's done well, you can map it on the U, and it will blow your mind, right? But what was missing is we didn't have a structure and a methodology for dealing with structural violence, right? For dealing with organizational change. And so the drift between these two things had gotten bigger and bigger. And what meeting Otto did and coming into awareness of Theory U offered was a whole different way to organize and to build containers for organizational change. And so it was about 18 years ago that my colleagues and I here in New York, along with John O'Brien, developed these learning institutes for innovation based on Theory U. And it was a completely different methodology for bringing organizations into the question of how do we shift? How do we practice? How do we connect? How do we put back together individual change and organizational change? And it was like person-centered planning. The early years were very powerful, very significant. Many organizations made significant and important changes and invested in innovation. And we had a lot to build on and build up. And so that was one part of this part, organizational change. We have a method, we have a structure, we have a social movement, right? Because Theory U was all of these things that had been part of my early formation, a method, practices, and as much as anything, a social movement, a group of people who believe that this is our job, right, to make a difference. Now, I don't want to separate Theory U from meeting Arowana Hayashi, which happened about the same time, because Arowana and I began a collaboration that's gone on for these last 18 years of bringing the arts, the social arts, the embodiment practices, the visual arts, other ways of knowing in particular, which had been a very important part of my work. And so Otto's orientation really strengthened our confidence in organizational change, and Arowana's orientation and work really strengthened our confidence in other ways of knowing and in supporting people to literally be in movement together. And I can talk for a very long time about that, but I'll see what you want to know and think about next.
Maybe you can, thank you very much for all of this. It's very interesting, and I'm curious to ask you, maybe you can tell us an example, share with us an example of an organizational transformation that maybe illustrates how theory or using the social arts was like assisted the process and what it enabled to happen.
I think when we tell stories and when we see examples, then that's really what touches us and moves us to stick with all of this, to stay in the journey. And I will do that in the framework that I've been describing thus far, which is that here we are, a social movement, really a global movement, that is a group of people who imagine a world that works for everyone. And what we mean by that is that where every person has a place, every life has value, every person has the opportunity for dignity and a good life, a life that is full of richness and quality and relationships and belonging. And so we have been learning how to move away from, these are some photographs from Willowbrook State School. Willowbrook was in New York City, in Staten Island, and this is an example of a day room in a state hospital in those days, the 60s and 70s, where we had both attentional violence and we also have structural violence, right? So this is what I encountered, although honestly what I experienced was even more extreme than this. And we are living at a time where, as a result of the Willowbrook deinstitutionalization, many people have moved to the community, but honestly, their lives were not necessarily growing in an imaginative way, in a meaningful way. And so what we are learning from organizations that are engaged in deep innovation is, I think this expresses it as well as anything, that each of us is said to be of infinite worth, each single one of us, God's viceroy. Can you imagine if we really believed that? All right. And so we have here an image of there being a star of possibility, right? That sort of individual soul coming to life in relationship to other people. There's a star, there's a purpose, there's a life meaning for every person. And we are trying to identify we're trying to engage in a lifelong journey where possibilities come to life. And we have referred to that as lives of distinction. And distinction isn't greatness, it's not grandness, it's just showing up in real ways, in real communities, in a meaningful way. There are places that need the gift for every single person in every single community. And there are possibilities to belong that revitalize people, purpose, and places. So it's not just that the lives of people with disabilities change, but the whole community around people shifts and is revitalized when inclusion happens well. Let's remember that structural violence kind of strangles this beautiful list, right? This sounds good, great, but we depend on service systems that are not organized and mental models and our entire orientation to humanity that doesn't build on this possibility. So here we are with a wonderful Kelly Berg illustration. What I would like to describe here is that there are four, really five essential elements to organizational change that we've been learning about and from through our work with Theory U and learning institutes. What was happening is that focus on people's capacities was already being disconnected from innovation, from organizational innovation. And so we know now more clearly than ever that without a devotion to organizational innovation, real change does not happen. And in order for innovation to take root in our world, we have to associate with people beyond our own world. So you're going to hear me talk about associating with employers, with artists, with theater people, with citizen advocates, with ordinary people. And finally, there's the fourth element, which is activate all of this possibility, mostly through engaging absolutely everyone involved in showing up and being invested in, and also discovering and being invested through their own call, through their own sense of purpose, right? And engagement in making a difference, not just getting through a certification or corporate compliance or all the other things that take us away from our attention, take our attention away from these other four elements, other three elements. And so in order to do that, I'll just mention briefly the heart. There's the heart and soul. Here we have the you in the middle of this, right? The you is the space where we are holding this potential for each person, and we're taking on all of those elements in the service of real deep change. But we have, for the last 50 years, basically helped people discover their own pathways by focusing more on capacities, which is coded in the green, in the face of everything they're up against, which is coded in the red. And so through art and storytelling and images and embodiment, virtually every engagement in the social arts is an effort to support people to shift their awareness, both individual and collective, from sometimes little tiny dots of green to a bigger sense of our capacity, and to keep amplifying that over time. And so art is relevant to everything we do, because many of the people that we are in this reflective practice with do not read or write or speak. There are many reasons why I was already using art in our practice before meeting Arowana, but the social arts and what Arowana and Presencing Institute values just took it to a whole nother level, right? So these are just examples of some color coding. There's a process called mapping, which is very similar to generative graphics, Kelvy's work. We have used that in all personal futures planning. Making power portraits, so there's a visual element where people they transfer their awareness about what they want more and what kinds of things they hope to build in their life into their own renderings, right? So their own diagrams, however they unfold. These are just examples. This set of power portraits is currently on display in a museum in Georgia, the Tubman African American Museum. This is a power portrait from the Navajo Nation out in New Mexico. So these are combinations of visual frameworks, right? So here we have visual frameworks from the learning institutes that also mirror this red and green 18 years of learning institutes. So community mapping, highly interactive, kind of rough and tumble. That poster has gone all over the state. Here is a group of people involved in creating the sense of the collective movement, right? So all of these efforts and all of this investment in the arts is a part of people deepening their sense that they are makers, right? We are makers. We are makers of new possibilities, and we are makers on many levels. So we had the chance, before COVID, there was a gathering called the Toronto Summer Institute. We used social presencing theater every summer with people from all over the world. In this picture alone, people from Australia, California, Canada, Georgia. And this is a 4D map, right? So we talk about 4D mapping. We have engaged and supported a lot of 4D mapping among ourselves and in the wider community. This is an example of another performance, and I'll describe this and then I'll check in because I know we're coming up to the end here. Here we have Arowana. We were involved with a group of people in Haverstraw, New York. Well, Haverstraw, New York, 85% of the people there are Spanish speaking. And this is a senior program that decided to use social presencing as a way to engage everyone in their own organization to think about change. So here you have bus drivers and, the support people from every corner of the organization. And just to, not to get into the detail, but just to be reminded that here we are as a collective, naming our stuck, as Arowana would say, the red places, and identifying possibility in the green. So here we have another backdrop, right? Big backdrop. And here we have the plan for the theater production, right? So I can't say enough about how powerful these theater performances have been. This is just an example of how, of the drawing for how an entire group of people, the whole performance is based on the pedagogy with the individuals in the program, right? This is not a situation where Arowana and I and other people come in and give people a script. The entire performance emerges from people listening to each other, and then it starts to take a shape, and then it is an offering to the community. And so here you have Act 1, where we're stuck, Act 2, where we know we can be, and Act 3, what more is possible. Here we are in Act 1, playing with our lives like a poker game where people are like poker chips. Here we have towards the end where people are talking about their prototypes. And then also there is a final, in a part of all of these offerings, there are cafe conversations among small groups of people where every person listens into their own place where they want to step forward and make a difference in whatever role they're in. So I will, in the interest of time, I'll put a little pause in here. I'm just showing you some other sculpturing. This is another way that we use stuck, particularly when COVID hit and we were on our screens. But we called it What Your Hands Know. And that's another aspect of that I think is a part of this signature of what we keep learning, is that it's important to adapt virtually every practice and methodology to fit the community and the people that we want to learn with and listen to. So anyway, over to you.
These are such vivid examples of how you've been using social arts into this work, and the combination between, you know, the Kelvi's work and Arwana's work, and how you've incorporated this into like real work with the people is really inspiring. So thanks for sharing that, and I think the pictures really bring that to life. I actually want to go back and ask my final question, at least going back to you, Beth. So we've talked about person-centered. So I want to go back and ask, like, how has meaning theory along the way impacted, if at all, yourself? Like, what impact did it have on your life?
Well, I think it's fair to say that at the time that I encountered Theory U and began a different path, right, that I was pretty, not just me, but our whole community was pretty discouraged, if not depressed, if not like feeling that here we had worked so hard to unlock possibilities for people, but that it was not humane to leave people hanging, so to speak, in situations where we didn't have the capacity to shift the larger context, other than through using rhetoric. And so anyway, I think it was a long journey through despair, really, a lot of anguish and a lot of despair in living in the gap between what we knew was possible and what was really going on, which still continues, no doubt, if not as much as ever, right? So one thing we learned to do is live in that gap and stay in it together, and to be a part of the global PI community where so many people are involved in their own journeys, staying in the gap, right? Going through the gap, right? Being in the gap, going through the gap, living in that gap, staying in that gap, and still being open-hearted and finding the next step, together. Yeah, I think that as much as anything, it's this collective sense of courage-making and confidence and curiosity and a language that really helps us understand our own inner experience, but then also interpret the outside forces that are bearing down on people and finding the ways that those can perhaps shift and experiencing the shift, right? That's where embodiment, I think, has so much power. It gives us a way to remember that we can move.
That was beautifully said. Thanks, that was really helpful.
Yes, I identify so much, and in the period that we're living within now, we feel it every day. The way you articulated it is very strong.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for that.
I really appreciate it.
Well, I want to make it's important to say on record that I want to make it really clear. In a short presentation like this, we tell our best stories, right? And they're often transformative and revelatory, and that these are long hauls, right? All of it is long. And one reason that people have dropped the organizational agenda in so many ways is that it's so hard. It's just so hard. It's so utterly baffling and frustrating and maddening. And it brings in, we have to deal with power and money and all the things that are just so challenging for people to grapple with. And so yes, but staying in that gap, we just keep trying to find another crack, right? Once again, to use our language, our framework, finding a crack in which a seed might grow.
Yeah.
Thank you for that again.
Yeah.